The morning sun painted the black hills in shades of gold and crimson, as smoke from cooking fires rose gently into the crisp autumn air. In the small valley where the Lakota people had made their home for generations, life moved with the steady rhythm of the seasons. Wikapi KT stood at the edge of the village, watching his twin children chase each other between the buffalo hide lodges. At 30 winters he had earned respect as one of the village's finest warriors, but moments like these reminded him that his greatest treasures were not his weapons or his horses, but the laughter of his son Dakota and daughter Ayana. "Papa, watch me!" Ayana called out as she attempted to climb the tall lodge pole in the center of camp. Her brother Dakota was already halfway up, grinning down at her with the confidence that only a 10-year-old boy could possess. Wikapiketi smiled, remembering his own childhood in this same valley. His father had taught him to hunt in these hills, to read the signs of weather in the clouds, and to listen to the voices of his ancestors in the wind. Now he was passing those same lessons to his own children. Just as countless generations had done before him, the village of Maka Waste was small, home to only 60 souls, but it was rich in ways that couldn't be counted in horses or buffalo. Robes. The people here lived as their grandparents had lived, following the sacred path that connected them to the earth and sky. They hunted when the spirits provided game, gathered healing plants when the seasons were right, and performed the ancient ceremonies that kept the world in balance. Chief Tatanka Najin emerged from his lodge, his gray braids catching the morning light. The old chief moved slowly now, his joints stiff from too many winters and too many battles, but his mind remained sharp as a steel knife. He had seen more changes in his 70 years than any man should have to witness. He remembered when the first white settlers had appeared on the distant plains, when they were few and seemed harmless. Now their numbers grew like grass after spring rain, and their hunger for land seemed endless. "Wikapi KT," the chief called softly, "walk with me." The two men strolled to the edge of the village where the sacred burial ground rested on a low hill overlooking the valley. Here lay the bones of their ancestors, warriors and mothers, chiefs and children, all resting in the earth that had given them life. Eagle feathers and colored stones marked the graves, and sweet grass burned constantly in small fires tended by the village women. "I have troubling dreams," the chief said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I see dark clouds gathering over our people, not rain clouds but something else. Something that brings change we are not ready for." Wikapi KT had heard similar talk from the traders who sometimes passed through their valley. They spoke of gold found in the sacred Black Hills, of white men pouring into the territory like ants following a trail of honey. But here in their hidden valley, protected by steep hills and thick forests, such troubles seemed as distant as the stars. "The treaties protect us," Wikapi KT said, though he heard the uncertainty in his own voice. "The Great Father in Washington promised that these lands would belong to our people forever." Chief Tatanka Najin made a sound that might have been laughter, but held no humor. "I have seen many promises broken, my young friend. I have touched the pen to many papers that said one thing and meant another. The white man's words are like autumn leaves, beautiful to look at, but they blow away with the first strong wind." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the village come alive below them. Winona, Wikapi Kate's wife, knelt beside their lodge, braiding sweetgrass for the evening ceremony. She was the most beautiful woman in the village, with eyes that sparkled like stars reflected in still water, and a laugh that could chase away the darkest mood. She had chosen him from among several suitors, and even after 10 years of marriage, he still wondered what he had done to deserve such happiness. The village's holy man, Waken Tanka Najin, sat cross-legged before the medicine lodge, sorting herbs and roots that would be used in healing ceremonies. He was older than the chief, so ancient that some of the children whispered he had been present when the world was first created. His hands, gnarled like old tree roots, still moved with sure precision as he prepared medicines that could heal both body and spirit. Women worked together preparing buffalo hides, their voices rising and falling in old songs that told the stories of their people. Children played games that taught them the skills they would need as adults. the boys practicing with small boughs, the girls learning to identify edible plants and medicinal herbs. Everything in the village had its place and purpose, like pieces of a great puzzle that had been assembled over countless generations. But even in this peaceful valley, changes were creeping in like shadows at sunset. Some of the young men spoke of leaving to join the great chiefs like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, who were gathering warriors to fight the white soldiers. Others talked of the reservation agents who promised food and safety to any who would abandon the old ways and live under government protection. Wikapikate's brother-in-law, Matunajin, had visited from another village the previous moon. He brought stories that made the women clutch their children closer and the men reach instinctively for their weapons. Entire villages had been forced to move, their people scattered like seeds in a windstorm. Sacred sites had been trampled by wagon wheels and desecrated by men who saw no difference between holy ground and ordinary dirt. They say the blue soldiers are building new forts, Matunajin had reported around the evening fire. They say any Indian found off the reservation after the winter snows will be considered hostile, even if they are only hunting to feed their families. These stories troubled Wikapikate's sleep, but in the daylight, surrounded by the familiar sights and sounds of his childhood home, they seemed like tales from another world. Here, eagles still soared over the hills as they had since the beginning of time. Here, the buffalo still came to drink from the clear stream that ran through the heart of the valley. Here, the sacred fires still burned, and the old prayers still rose with the smoke to reach the ears of the Creator. As the day wore on, Wikapikate performed his duties as one of the village's Akashita, the warrior police who kept order and protected the people. He checked the horse herd grazing in the meadow below the village, making sure no animals had wandered off or been taken by raiders. He walked the boundaries of their territory, looking for signs that strangers had passed through their land. In the afternoon, he joined a hunting party that rode out in search of elk. The hunting was good. The spirits had blessed them with fat animals that would provide meat for the coming winter. As they rode back to the village with their kill, Wikapikate felt the deep satisfaction that came from providing for his family and his people. That evening, as the sun set behind the western peaks, the village gathered for the daily ceremony of Thanksgiving. Wakantanka Najin offered prayers to the four directions, thanking the spirits for another day of life, for the food they had received, for the safety of their families. The sweet smoke of burning sage and sweetgrass carried their words skyward, and for a moment all the troubles of the outside world seemed very far away. Later, as his children slept peacefully in their buffalo robes and Winona sat beside the fire-mending moccasins, Wikapikate allowed himself to believe that this life could continue forever. Tomorrow would bring another sunrise over the sacred hills, another day of hunting and ceremony, another evening of stories and laughter around the fire. He had no way of knowing that this was to be one of the last peaceful nights his village would ever see. The first sound that pierced the dawn silence was not the usual call of morning birds, but the thundering of many horses moving fast across the valley floor. Wikapikate's eyes snapped open in his buffalo robe bed, his warrior instincts immediately alert. Something was wrong. The rhythm of those hoofbeats spoke of danger, not the gentle movement of their own horse herds. Beside him, Winona stirred, her hand instinctively reaching for their sleeping children. "What is it?" she whispered, though her voice already carried the fear that comes when a mother senses threat to her young. Before Wikapikate could answer, the first gunshot cracked across the valley like thunder splitting the sky, then another, and another. The peaceful morning exploded into chaos as dozens of armed men on horseback swept into the village from 3 different directions, their weapons firing into the lodges where families still lay sleeping. Wikapikate rolled from his bed and grabbed his bow and quiver, his mind racing to understand what was happening. Through the buffalo hide walls of their lodge, he could hear screaming, the high-pitched cries of frightened children mixing with the deeper shouts of men trying to organize a defense that had come too late. "Stay down," he commanded his family as bullets began to tear through their lodge covering. But even as he said it, he knew there was no safety here. The attackers had surrounded the village completely. This was not a raid for horses or captives. This was something else entirely. Winona was already moving, gathering their children in her arms. 10-year-old Dakota was awake now, his eyes wide with terror, but his young face set with the same courage that ran in his father's blood. Little Ayana clung to her mother, too frightened to cry, her small body shaking like a leaf in winter wind. "The back of the lodge," Wikapi KT said quickly. "I will cut through, get the children to the river, hide in the tall grass until it is safe." But even as he drew his knife to slice through the hide wall, armed men appeared at their lodge entrance. The first was a soldier in the blue uniform of the cavalry, his face hard and set for killing. Behind him came others, some in uniform, some dressed as civilians, but all carrying weapons and wearing the same expression of men who had come to do terrible work. "No!" Winona screamed as the first soldier raised his rifle. Wikapi KT launched himself forward, his war cry filling the small space of their home. His knife found the soldier's chest before the man could fire, but there were too many others. A rifle butt crashed against his skull, sending him tumbling backward as stars exploded behind his eyes. Through the ringing in his head, he heard Winona's voice rise in a death song, the ancient melody their people sang when facing the end of all things. She was trying to shield their children with her own body, her arms spread wide like the wings of a mother bird protecting her nest. The gunshots that followed seemed to echo forever in the small lodge. When Wikapi Kate's vision cleared, his world had ended. Winona lay still, her beautiful face peaceful now as if she had simply fallen asleep. Dakota was beside her, his small hand still reaching toward his father. Only Ayana moved, crawling toward the back wall of the lodge on her hands, a knee's bright red blood trailing behind her. "Ayana!" he cried, trying to reach her, but rough hands grabbed him and dragged him outside into a scene from the worst of nightmares. The entire village was burning. The sacred medicine lodge, which had stood for generations and housed the most holy objects of their people, was already consumed by flames that reached toward the morning sky like grasping fingers. Everywhere he looked, he saw his friends and relatives lying motionless in the grass that was now stained red with their blood. Chief Tatanka Najin stood near the center of the village, holding a piece of white cloth above his head in the universal sign of surrender. The old chief was speaking in the white man's language, trying to explain that they were peaceful people, that they had committed no crimes. The soldier who shot him down didn't even pause to listen to his words, the holy man. Wakentanka Najin was trying desperately to save the sacred bundles from the burning medicine lodge. These were the most precious possessions of their people, bundles containing objects and medicines that connected them to their ancestors and to the spirit world. The old man's clothes were already smoking from the heat as he reached again and again into the flames. A group of soldiers surrounded him, laughing at his efforts. One of them, a man with the marking of a leader, seemed to take particular pleasure in the destruction. He ordered his men to push the holy man back into the flames, then stood watching as the sacred bundles burned, each one representing centuries of spiritual knowledge that could never be replaced. Wikapi KT fought against the hands that held him, but his head wound made the world spin and dance before his eyes. He could only watch helplessly as everything he had ever loved was destroyed in front of him. The soldiers moved through the village methodically, checking each lodge, shooting anyone who still moved, taking anything of value they could carry. Some of the village women tried to run toward the river with their children, hoping to reach the safety of the thick brush that grew along the water's edge. Most were cut down before they had taken 10 steps. A few, maybe 5 or 6, disappeared into the tall grass. Wikapi KT prayed to all the spirits that his daughter was among them. The killing went on for what seemed like hours, but was probably only minutes. When it was finished, 43 people lay dead in the grass that had once been their peaceful home. The survivors, those few who had not been shot, were herded together like cattle. Most were women and children, some wounded, all too shocked to fully understand what had happened to their world. The soldier leader, the one who had watched the sacred bundles burn, walked among the bodies with the casual attitude of a man inspecting his day's work. He seemed pleased with what he saw. When he came to where Wikapikati lay bleeding, he prodded him with his boot. "This one's still breathing," the soldier said to his men. "Finish him." A rifle was pointed at Wikapikate's head, but at that moment, a scout rode up with news that other cavalry units were approaching. The leader cursed and ordered his men to mount up immediately. They had accomplished what they came to do. The village was destroyed, its people scattered or dead. There was no point in risking a fight with other military units who might ask uncomfortable questions about what had happened here. As the sound of horses faded into the distance, silence fell over the valley. The only sounds were the crackling of still burning lodges and the soft moaning of the wind through the grass where so many had fallen. Wikapikati lay among the dead, his blood mixing with the sacred earth of his ancestors, his spirit hovering. Somewhere between this world and the next. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and still he did not move. Perhaps he was dead and simply did not know it yet. Perhaps his spirit had already begun the journey to join his wife and son in the land beyond the stars. He felt no pain now, only a great emptiness that seemed to swallow everything inside him. But then he heard something that pulled him back from the edge of forever. A small voice, weak and frightened, calling his name. "Papa? Papa, where are you?" Ayana. His daughter lived. Somehow, incredibly, she had survived the destruction of their world. With effort that seemed to require all the strength he had ever possessed, Wikapikati opened his eyes and saw her small face looking down at him, streaked with dirt and tears but alive, wonderfully alive. In that moment, lying in the ruins of everything he had ever known, Wikapikati made a choice that would define the rest of his days. He would not die here among the dead, not yet, not while his daughter needed him. Not while the men who had done this terrible thing still walked, free under the same sky that now looked down on so much sorrow. Death would have to wait. He had other business to attend to first. For 7 days and 7 nights, Wikapikati lay among the dead of his village, existing in a place between the world of the living and the realm of spirits. His body remained still, so motionless that even the carrion birds circling overhead would not approach him. It was as if they sensed that something had changed in this man, something that made him different from ordinary prey. During those long days, his mind drifted like smoke on the wind. Sometimes he was a child again, learning to track deer with his father in these same hills. Sometimes he was a young warrior counting coup on enemy horses, feeling the rush of victory and the praise of his elders. But always, inevitably, his thoughts returned to that terrible morning when gunshots had shattered the peace of dawn and taken everything that mattered from his world. On the 8th day, as the sun painted the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, he heard a sound that pulled him back from the edge of the spirit world. It was the soft splash of small feet moving through the shallow water of the stream that ran past the village. Then came a voice he knew better than his own heartbeat. "Papa? Papa, please wake up. I'm scared and I don't know what to do." Ayana knelt beside him, her small hands touching his face with the gentleness of a summer breeze. She was thin now, thinner than any child should be, her clothes torn and dirty from hiding in the wilderness for over a week. But her eyes still held that spark of life that had always reminded him so much of her mother. "I hid by the beaver dam like you taught me," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmur of flowing water. "I waited and waited for you to come find me, but you never came. So I came to look for you instead." With effort that felt like lifting a mountain, Wikapikati opened his eyes and looked at his daughter. The world around them was a wasteland of burned lodge poles and scattered bones, a place where death had visited and left its mark on everything. But Ayana was alive, and that single fact was enough to anchor his spirit back to this world. "My little Star," he whispered, using the pet name he had called her since she was small enough to carry in one arm. "You should not have come back here. This place is not safe." But even as he said the words, he knew there was nowhere truly safe for them now. The old world was gone, destroyed as completely as if it had never existed. The life they had known, the village that had been their universe, the family that had been their joy, all of it had vanished in the space of a single morning, slowly, Painfully, he sat up and pulled his daughter into his arms. She felt so small and fragile, like a bird that had fallen from its nest. For a long moment, they simply held each other, drawing comfort from the warmth of the only family either of them had left. "What happened to Mama and to Koda?" Ayana asked, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer. "They have gone to walk the spirit trail," he said gently, using the words their people spoke when someone passed from this world to the next. "They are with our ancestors now in the land, where there is no pain and no sorrow." She nodded solemnly, accepting this truth with the wisdom that children sometimes possess when faced with tragedy beyond their understanding. "Will we see them again?" "Someday," he promised, "but not yet. We have things to do in this world first." Together, they walked through the ruins of their village, gathering what little remained that could be saved. Most of the useful items had been taken by the soldiers or destroyed in the fires, but they found a few things: a knife, a water pouch, some dried meat that had been hidden in a storage pit the attackers had missed. The hardest task was burying their dead. With only the two of them to do the work, and with Wikapi KT still weak from his injuries, it took 3 full days to lay their people to rest according to the proper traditions. They wrapped each body in whatever material they could find and placed them in shallow graves facing west, toward the land where the spirits dwelt. As they worked, Ayana told him what she had seen from her hiding place by the water. She had watched the soldiers move through the village, had seen the man who seemed to be their leader as he gave orders, and watched the sacred lodge burn. She described him in detail, his uniform, his horse, the cruel smile on his face as he surveyed the destruction. "He had marks on his sleeve," she said, tracing patterns in the dirt with her finger. "Like this." And he rode a black horse with white spots on its face. Wikapi KT memorized every detail she shared. This information would be important later. When the time came for accounting, on the 4th day after Ayana's return, they performed the ceremony of mourning according to their traditions. Wikapi KT cut his long hair short and scored his arms and legs with his knife, letting his blood fall on the earth where his family had died, but where tradition called for a year of grieving. Before taking any action, he felt only a cold fire burning in his chest, a need for justice that grew stronger with each passing hour. "We cannot stay here," he told his daughter as they sat beside the cold ashes of what had once been their lodge. "This place belongs to the dead now. We must find somewhere safe for you to live." The journey to the nearest reservation took 5 days of walking through country that had once been familiar but now seemed strange and threatening. Every sound made them freeze and listen, every movement in the grass made them ready to run or hide. The world had become a dangerous place for their people, and they were just 2 small figures moving across a landscape that no longer welcomed them. The reservation was a place of sadness, crowded with people from many different tribes who had been forced to leave their ancestral homes and live together in a space too small for so many souls. But among the displaced families, Wikapi KT found distant relatives who agreed to care for Ayana. The night before he left her there, they sat together under a sky full of stars, and he made her a promise that would change both their lives forever. "I am going away for a while," he said, choosing his words carefully. "There are things I must do, debts that must be paid. But I will come back for you when my work is finished." "What kind of work, Papa?" He was quiet for a long time, listening to the night sounds around the reservation, the cry of an owl, the distant howling of coyotes, the soft murmur of voices from other families settling down for sleep. Finally, he spoke the words that would define the rest of his days. "The men who killed our family and destroyed our village are still alive. They are still free to do the same thing to other innocent people. This is not right." The spirits cry out for balance to be restored. Ayana was only 10 years old, but she had seen enough of the world's cruelty to understand what he meant. "You're going to hunt them, yes. Will you come back?" "I will come back," he promised. "But the man who returns to you may not be the same man who leaves tomorrow. Sometimes when we walk in dark places for too long, we come back changed. The next morning, he kissed his daughter goodbye and walked away from the reservation without looking back. If he had turned around, he might have seen the tears on her face, and those tears might have weakened his resolve. But his path was chosen. Now, and there could be no turning back, from that day forward, Wikapikati ceased to exist in the world of the living. In his place walked something else, something that moved like shadow and struck like lightning. The survivors at the reservation began to call him by a new name, Wanagi, which meant ghost in their language. He spent weeks learning to move unseen through the white man's world. Studying their habits and their weaknesses, he learned their language by listening at windows and hiding near their gathering places. He watched their soldiers and learned their routines. Most importantly, he began to track down the men who had destroyed his world. The hunt had begun. The first man died on a cold November morning, 3 months after the destruction of Maka Waste village. His name was Thompson, and he had been one of the local militia members who rode with the soldiers that terrible dawn. He was found by fellow hunters 2 days later, deep in the forest where he had gone to trap beaver, an arrow through his heart and war paint symbols marked on nearby trees. Wanagi had watched Thompson for weeks, learning his habits like a wolf studies its prey. The man lived alone in a small cabin near the edge of the wilderness, supporting himself by selling furs to traders who passed through the territory. He was a crude man who drank too much and talked too loudly about his part in what he called cleaning out that nest of hostiles. But when death came for him, Thompson died quietly, with only the wind in the pine trees to hear his final breath. Wanagi took nothing from the body except the satisfaction of knowing that one debt had been paid. He left the arrow as a message, marked with the sacred symbols of his village so that anyone who found it would know that justice had visited this place. The second man lasted until winter's heart, when the snow lay thick on the ground and most sensible people stayed close to their fires. His name was Crawford, another militiaman who had bragged in the local saloons about the good work done at the Indian village. He had a wife and 2 young children, and for weeks Wanagi struggled with the knowledge that killing this man would leave a family without a father. But then he remembered Ayana's small voice describing how this same man had laughed while children died, how he had kicked the body of Chief Tatanka Nugent to make sure the old man was dead. The memory hardened his heart like ice hardens water, and when Crawford rode out alone to check his trap lines, he never returned home by spring. 5 more men had died, each death as silent and mysterious as morning mist. The local newspapers began writing about the ghost warrior, describing a phantom Indian who could strike anywhere and vanish without a trace. Some claimed he could walk through walls or turn himself invisible. Others said he was already dead, a vengeful spirit, returned from beyond the grave to punish the living. The truth was simpler and more frightening. Wanagi had become something beyond ordinary human understanding, a man who moved between 2 worlds like smoke drifting between the realms of the living and the dead. He knew every game trail in the Black Hills, every cave and hidden valley, every place where a man could disappear and wait for the perfect moment to strike. He lived like his ancestors had lived when they were at war, sleeping under the stars, eating what the land provided, moving constantly to stay ahead of the soldiers who hunted him. His body grew thin and hard as seasoned wood, his senses sharp as a hunting hawk's. He could track a man by the faintest sign, could read the story of a day's events in a few bent grass stems or disturbed stones, but the civilian militia members had been the easy prey. Now came the greater challenge, the soldiers themselves. These men traveled in groups, lived in fortified places, and followed military discipline that made them much harder to reach. Wanagi spent months watching the nearest army post, learning their routines, identifying the men who had been present at his village's destruction. His first military target was a sergeant named Bailey, a career soldier who had served on the frontier for 15 years. Bailey had been one of the men who held Wikapikati down while others killed his family, and his face was burned into memory like a brand into leather. The sergeant was careful and suspicious, never traveling alone, always armed and alert, but every man has weaknesses. And Wanagi had learned patience from the hunting spiders that waited motionless in their webs until the perfect moment to strike. Bailey's weakness was a woman in the nearby town, a saloon girl he visited every month when he could get leave from the fort. The sergeant's route to town led through a narrow canyon where the walls rose high on both sides and the trail followed. A winding creek dot, it was there that Bailey met his end, on a moonless night when the darkness was thick as black wool. His body was found the next morning by a patrol sent to look for him, and the arrow in his chest carried the same markings that had been found at every other scene. The ghost warrior had struck again, and this time he had reached inside the armies. Own ranks. Fear began to spread through the military post like wildfire through dry grass. Soldiers who had laughed at stories of the phantom Indian now checked over their shoulders when they rode patrol. Officers who had dismissed the deaths as coincidence began to take extra precautions, doubling guards and restricting individual movement outside the forts, but Wanagi's knowledge of the white man's world had grown as sharp as his knowledge of the wilderness. He had learned their language perfectly, had studied their customs and their weaknesses. He could move among them when necessary, disguised as a half-breed scout or traveling trader, his face painted with mud and his hair cut short in their fashion. One by one, the soldiers who had participated in the massacre began to disappear. Some died while hunting, others while traveling between posts. A few simply vanished without a trace, their bodies never found, as if the earth itself had swallowed them. Each disappearance was marked by the same calling card, an arrow bearing the symbols of the destroyed village, a reminder that the dead had not been forgotten. The newspapers in distant cities picked up the story, writing sensational accounts of the mysterious Indian who seemed to be waging a one-man war against the United States Army. Some writers portrayed him as a bloodthirsty savage, others as a noble figure seeking justice for his murdered people. But none of them understood the truth, that Wanagi was no longer fully human, but something that existed in the spaces between life and death, driven by a purpose that burned in him like an eternal flame. 2 years passed, then 3. The list of the dead grew longer, and the list of those who still lived grew shorter. But the greatest prize remained beyond reach: Colonel Hartwell, the man who had led the attack on Makawaste village. The colonel had been promoted after his successful action against hostile Indians and transferred to a post in Colorado Territory, far from the Black Hills where the ghost warrior hunted. For months, Wanagi tracked his quarry across hundreds of miles of prairie and mountain, following rumors and reports like a bloodhound follows a scent. Hartwell was a careful man, surrounded by guards and rarely traveling the same route twice. But he was also proud and ambitious. A man who believed his military rank made him untouchable. The colonel's mistake was accepting an assignment to transport military payroll between 2 mountain forts during the worst blizzard in 20 years. He believed the weather would protect him better than any number of guards, that no enemy could move through such conditions. But he had forgotten that his enemy was no ordinary man. The storm that night was fierce enough to blind the eyes and freeze the breath in a man's lungs. Wind howled through the mountain passes like the voices of angry spirits, and snow fell so thick it seemed to erase the world itself. But through it all, a figure moved like a shadow-given substance, following the soldier's trail with supernatural persistence. When morning came and the storm passed, search parties found the bodies scattered along the trail like broken dolls. Colonel Hartwell lay apart from his men, and on his chest was carved the symbol that had haunted the nightmares of every soldier on the frontier. The mark of the ghost warrior's justice, but victory, when it finally came, tasted like ashes in Wanagi's mouth. 3 years of hunting and killing had hollowed him out like a gourd scraped clean, leaving nothing inside but emptiness and the echo of his own footsteps on the trail of revenge. He had become exactly what his enemies called him: a ghost. Something that existed but was no longer truly alive, standing over the body of the last man on his list. Wanagi realized that his war was finished. Every person responsible for the destruction of his village had been called to account. Justice had been served according to the old laws, the laws that demanded blood for blood and life for life. But now what? He had lived for 3 years with only one purpose, and that purpose was complete. He was like a warrior who had won a great battle only to discover that victory had cost him everything he had once fought to protect. The journey back to the ruins of Maka Waste Village took Wanagi 7 days, though he could have made the trip in half that time. Something inside him was reluctant to return to the place where his old life had died and his new one had been born. For 3 years he had lived with a single purpose burning in his chest like a sacred fire. Now that the fire had been extinguished, he felt strangely empty, like a lodge after all the people have moved away. When he finally stood on the hill overlooking the valley where his village had once thrived, the sight took his breath away. Nature had already begun to reclaim the land. Prairie grass grew tall where lodge circles had once been marked in the earth. Wildflowers bloomed in colors of yellow, purple, and red where his people had once walked and laughed and lived their daily lives. The burned lodge poles still stood like skeletal fingers pointing toward the sky, weathered now by 3 years of wind and rain and snow. Some had fallen, creating strange patterns on the ground that looked almost like the writing he had seen in the white man's books. But to him they told a different story, the story of a people who had lived in harmony with this land for countless generations. He walked slowly through the ruins, his feet finding paths that his memory knew by heart even though they were now invisible beneath the grass. Here had stood the lodge of Chief Tatanka Najin, where the old man had shared his wisdom with anyone who sought guidance. There had been the place where the women gathered to work on their beadwork and tell stories to the children. And over there, barely visible now, was the spot where his own family's lodge had welcomed visitors and sheltered the people he loved most in all the world. For the first time in 3 years, Wanagi allowed himself to feel something other than the cold anger that had sustained him through his long hunt. The emotion that came was not rage or hatred, but a grief so deep it seemed to reach down to the very bones of the earth. He had been so focused on making the guilty pay for their crimes that he had never allowed himself to properly mourn what had been lost. He knelt in the grass where his family had died and wept as he had not wept since the day he had buried them. The tears came like a spring flood, washing away years of accumulated pain and leaving him feeling strangely clean. It was as if some poison that had been building up inside him was finally being released. That night, he made camp on the hill, where the sacred burial ground had been. The wooden markers that had once identified each grave were long gone, rotted away or blown down by storms, but he knew where each of his people rested. He built a small fire and sat beside it as darkness fell over the valley, listening to the night sounds that his ancestors had heard for countless generations. The fire burned low, and still he sat in meditation, seeking guidance from the spirits of his people and from the Creator who watched over all living things. He had completed his mission of vengeance, but what was he supposed to do now? He was only 33 years old, still young enough to live another full lifetime, but he felt ancient inside, worn down by years of living only for death and retribution. On the second night, as he dozed beside the dying embers of his fire, the dream came. It was more vivid than any dream he had ever experienced, so real that he could smell the sweetgrass smoke and feel the warmth of familiar arms around him. Winona appeared to him as she had been in life, beautiful and serene, her eyes sparkling with the joy and wisdom that had first drawn him to her. She wore the white doeskin dress she had been married in, decorated with the intricate beadwork that had taken her months to complete. Her long black hair was braided with the sacred red ribbons that symbolized the life force flowing through all things. "My husband," she said, and her voice was like music heard across still water. "You have honored our family and our people with your quest for justice. The spirits of our village rest easier knowing that those who destroyed our world have been called to account for their actions." "I have done what needed to be done," he replied, though even in the dream his words felt hollow. "Every man who participated in the massacre of our people has paid the price." "Yes," she said, moving closer until he could see the love and concern in her eyes. "But tell me, what has this path cost you? Look at yourself, my beloved. What have you become?" In the dream, Wanagi looked down at his hands and saw them as they truly were, stained with blood, hardened by years of violence, transformed into the tools of death. When he looked up at his reflection in a nearby stream, he saw not the face of the man who had been a loving husband and father, but the cold mask of a killer who had forgotten how to feel anything except the need for revenge. "I became what I needed to become," he said, but the words sounded weak even to his own ears. "And now?" Winona asked gently. "What do you need to become now?" Before he could answer, two smaller figures appeared beside her, Dakota and Ayana, his children, though the Ayana in his dream was still the 10-year-old girl he had left behind, not the young woman she would be now. Dakota looked exactly as he had on the morning he died, full of life and mischief and the pure joy that only children possess. "Papa," Dakota said, his voice carrying the same mixture of love and gentle scolding that children use when they think their parents are being foolish. "Ayana needs you. She has been waiting for 3 years for her father to come back to her. But if you return to her as you are now, as this ghost you have become, she will not recognize the man who used to tell her bedtime stories and teach her to identify bird calls." "She needs her real father back," Ayana added, and in the dream she sounded older and wiser than her years. "Not the shadow of a man who has forgotten how to love anything except his anger." Winona stepped forward and placed her hand on his cheek, and he felt a warmth there that he had not experienced in 3 long years. "Your war is over, my husband. You have done everything that honor demanded. But now you must choose. Will you remain a ghost forever, trapped in the past and unable to touch the world of the living? Or will you remember who you were before? Grief and rage changed you into something else?" "I don't know if I can go back," he admitted. "I have done things, seen things, become things that cannot be undone. How do I return to being a man when I have spent so long being a weapon?" "The same way a river returns to its banks after a flood," she said softly. "Slowly, naturally, by following the path that the Creator intended. You are still the man I fell in love with, still the father who sang lullabies to our children. The person did not die in the massacre, he was only buried beneath the pain and anger. Now it is time to dig him up and let him live again." The dream began to fade, but before it disappeared completely, Winona spoke once more. "Go to your daughter. She is the bridge between the man you were and the man you can still become. Let her love remind you of what it means to be alive." When Wanagi woke, the sun was rising over the eastern hills, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded him of countless mornings from his childhood. For the first time in 3 years, he noticed the beauty of the dawn instead of seeing it simply as another day in his hunt for vengeance. He spent that morning performing a ceremony of release, burning offerings of sage and sweetgrass while speaking the ancient words that would free the spirits of the dead to continue their journey to the spirit world. Then he took his weapons, the bow that had never missed its mark, the knife that had taken so many lives, the war paint that had marked him as an instrument of death, and buried them beside the graves of his people. When he was finished, he cut his hair short and washed the permanent stains of war paint from his face. The man who emerged from that creek was not the same person who had entered it. Gone was the cold, frightening presence that had terrorized the frontier for 3 years. In its place stood someone who looked remarkably like the Wikapi KT who had once lived peacefully in this valley with his family. The journey to the reservation where he had left Ayana took 5 days. With each mile he traveled, he felt more of his humanity returning, like feeling coming back to a limb that has been numb with cold. He began to notice things again, the way sunlight looked filtering through leaves, the sound of birds singing in the morning, the simple pleasure of cool water when he was thirsty. When he finally reached the reservation, he almost didn't recognize his daughter. Ayana was 13 now, no longer the frightened child he had left behind, but a young woman who carried herself with quiet dignity and strength. She was teaching a group of younger children the old stories, keeping alive the traditions of their people in a world that seemed determined to erase them. She looked up and saw him standing at the edge of the gathering, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then recognition dawned in her eyes, and she ran to him with the same joy she had shown as a small child welcoming him home from a hunt. "Papa," she whispered as he held her close. I knew you would come back. I never stopped believing you would. Come back. I'm sorry I was gone so long, he said, and meant it more than any words he had ever spoken. I had to learn how to be your father again instead of just a man seeking revenge. And did you learn? She asked, looking up at him with eyes that seemed far too wise for someone so young.